Here, can you see my presentation? Okay. So once again, I'm Jason Paolo from the University of the Philippines, Baguio, and I'm here to present my paper with the title Vernacular Country Music Broadcasting and Indigenous Cultural Mediation in Baguio City, Philippines from 1959 up to the present. And so before anything else, I would like to briefly introduce to you, since most of our participants are from India, I would like to briefly introduce to you the Cordillera Administrative Region of the Philippines. And so, as you can see in the map, that's the Philippines, and the one in dark gray is the whole region of the Cordillera Administrative Region. So, geographically speaking, the Philippine Cordillera is located in the north-central section of Luzon Island. Surrounding it are Ilocos Region, Cagayan Valley, and so on and so forth. The region is about 230 kilometers in length and 120 kilometers in width. It houses Cordillera Mountain Ridge, also known as the Grand Cordillera Central, that holds 6 provinces, namely Abra, Apayao, Benguet, Ifugao, Kalinga, and Mountain Province, and one chartered city that is Baguio. So it houses actually several indigenous ethnolinguistic groups which are collectively called the Igorot people. Some of the major groups are the Kankanaey, Ibaloy, Apayao, Kalinga, and Tingyan, and they could still be subdivided into dozens of ethnolinguistic groups that have their own distinct cultures. So when speaking about music, produced by indigenous peoples in the Cordillera region in the Philippines, what comes to mind, at least in our country, most of the time, are those considered to be traditional. In every province, town, and indigenous communities in the region, we could find a rich variety of distinct cultural practices and artifacts related to music. Examples are the music of the Tingyan people of the province of Abra, such as the Daleleng that is sang during celebrations, and the Salagintok that is used to express friendship and even love. There is also the tradition of Dayang of the Kankanaey people, which is a form of courtship chant, and so on and so forth. However, as of this presentation that I'm doing right now, there are already new forms or genres that are being used and performed by indigenous peoples that are yet to gain traction in terms of being subjects of research and analysis in the academia. Some examples of such forms are the local country music produced by indigenous individuals in Baguio City and the province of Benguet, the so-called ethnopop in the province of Kalinga, and a contemporary version of the Salidumay music culture in the Kankanaey tribes here in Benguet as well. But what's more small in number are the studies related to the broadcasting of locally or even indigenous produced music or songs through radio. So therefore, this research actually focuses on analyzing the practice of vernacular or even indigenous music broadcasting in the city of Baguio. City of Baguio is actually a highly urbanized city located in the region where more than a dozen of radio stations, the signals of most of which could reach the whole region, are located. This research particularly presents a historical and ethnographic analysis of how indigenous people in Baguio and Benguet used vernacular music broadcasting in Baguio as a tool for the mediation of their own cultures. Specifically, I will present and narrate the history of the appropriation of radio broadcasting and the broadcasting of indigenous produced music in Baguio and Benguet. Second is to determine the methods how indigenous peoples of the Cordillera incorporated their locally produced music through radio in those locations. Third is to discuss the motivations and constraints that influenced and are influencing the performance of such a radio practice. And fourth is to illustrate how this practice could be considered as a form of cultural mediation and even resistance by indigenous peoples. So as a framework, I would like to introduce this concept, radio as a cultural battleground. So the democratic character or nature of radio as a form of mass media in various contexts serve as an open door for it to become an avenue for the dissemination of a variety and even competing voices, ideologies, worldviews, and cultures, among others. This makes it a space where battles emerge. This view of the mass media follows a radical democratic approach that claims that the media are a battleground between contending forces. Elizabeth Enriquez, one of the media historians here in the Philippines, also says the same, saying that forms of mass media, including radio broadcasting, are an arena of social and political contention. She adds that despite the view that the media are utilized to promote and enforce the control of the society's hegemonic forces, they could also be harnessed by those subjects of control or subordination for empowerment. In the cultural realm, radio can be considered as a battleground where hegemonic and non-hegemonic cultures clash. So, as a medium that primarily communicates and mediates through sound, radio, broadcasting, and the airwaves that it uses have become spaces where various voices battle for airtime, expression, recognition, and representation. On one side, the members of hegemonic cultures communicate and reinforce themselves and their dominance through media. On the other hand, non-dominant groups have also made media an agency for self-representation, mediation, and empowerment. For instance, in Faye Ginsberg and her co-writers, in their book Media Worlds, Anthropology and New Terrain, they describe how indigenous and other disenfranchised groups employed various forms of mass media to fulfill their counter-hegemonic agenda, that is, to facilitate their political empowerment. They note that such kinds of media products can provide a third space for the representation of their concerns. And the same is true, and the same has also been found to be the case of indigenous radio in Nepal, Australia, United States, and Mexico, as featured in the book Radio Fields, Anthropology and Wireless Sound in the 21st Century by Lucas Becerra and Daniel Fisher. Another example is this. We can look at the case of Philippine radio, at least during the period of 1922 to 1946. It has become a battleground between American colonialists and the Filipino people during that time. On the side of the colonial power, radio broadcasting was imported from the United States to communicate and promote American culture to the citizens of the country through the use of the English language on air and through the broadcasting of American music and programs. However, as premised by Elizabeth Enriquez, the Filipinos appropriated the practice, repurposed it from being the Americans' way of transmitting and reinforcing their culture to being a tool for the fulfillment of the goals of the Filipinos that are either cultural, economic, and political in character. So let's go now to my first part, which is the history. So I don't think I can go into detail into this history because there are a lot of details. I can just introduce what happened during these four periods. The first period is the early beginnings from 1959 to 1965. Next is the Marcos dictatorship from 1965 to 1968. The post-dictatorship in the 1990s from 1986 to 1999. And the 2000s and beyond from 2000 up to the present. But before that, even before the establishment of the first local radio station in Baguio City, the residents of the city already have access to those based in the capital, the national capital region, and some nearby provinces such as La Union. Despite the local absence of a station in the city, locals of the mountain province were able to seep to the national consciousness by airing local events and even local music in some radio stations outside the province. For example, is the love song titled Mangkayan Heaven that was aired through a Manila-based station, DZPI, in the 1950s. The song's music was composed by a local from the town of Mangkayan in Benguet, one of the provinces in the Cordillera region, and it talks about the beauty of the town of Mangkayan, one of the ancestral residences and domains of the Kangkanae people. When the first radio station in the city of Baguio first aired in 1959, the locals of Baguio, most of which are indigenous have indigenous lineages were given the chance to produce their own programs and showcase local events, personalities, and by extension, local and even indigenous cultures. During the first years of local radio broadcasting in Baguio, musical programs became prominent in terms of the amount of airtime allotted to them. In fact, most of the programs during this time were music, and one of those programs is titled Music Philippines that featured music from Metro Manila. So there was an absence of local music in radio stations during this time, and it was probably due to the scarcity in the number of professionally recorded ones. The only exception was the one I mentioned earlier titled Mangkayan Heaven. The other recordings were produced later in the 1960s. One example of the first songs to be professionally recorded was titled Nanlayad Nanlikatan, or The Love That We Suffered For, that had Kangkanai lyrics and was composed by a former vice governor of the Mountain Province. Meanwhile, during the presidency of the former dictator Ferdinand Marcos, locally produced songs such as those recorded by indigenous music artists like Rod Danggol and Mortadeo were aired over various radio stations in the city. At least one or two of their songs, which were mostly in the Ilocano language, were included in the playlist of many radio stations in the city. In 1975, a resolution number 7531 of the dictatorship um, ordered all radio stations with music programs nationwide to air at least one original Filipino music per broadcast hour, and later on it was increased to four original Filipino music per broadcast hour. This resulted in the growth of the music industry of the Philippines, and the radio stations in Baguio immediately adhered to the resolution in fear, of course, of imprisonment and so on. One way by which the stations followed the resolution was to feature songs composed and produced by local artists and indigenous artists in Baguio City. One of such program was titled Baguio Composers Club that was aired over all radio stations during that time. When the dictator was ousted by the Filipinos through the so-called People Power Revolt or EDSA Revolution in 1986, the nation, including the city of Baguio, arguably became relatively free. This empowered the people of Baguio, including the Igorot people, to air their content, which includes locally produced songs. The airing of local voices and talents also continued after the People Power Revolt. During this time, there was a popular movement, so that's called the Original Baguio Music Movement or OBM movement, that allowed radio stations to feature songs that were created by music groups from Baguio and nearby provinces, including those that are produced by indigenous peoples. So they featured songs by local indigenous artists such as Carlo and Maria Carino, the Baguio Band, and the Binhi Band. This is also true in radio stations such as DZBS, DZWT, and so on and so forth. One station, DZWR, even reformatted their whole station to air only country music, including those composed and recorded by indigenous individuals in the region. And finally, in the 2000s, songs, performers, and stories about and from the Cordillera remained as parts of the daily broadcasts of radio stations in Baguio. Although this is not already dominant in radio stations because of the entry of various ethnicities here in the city, they still had songs and live performances of local composers, musicians, and singers. And some radio stations were put up again and they incorporated this music as well. Even during this time, when the prominence of social media in the Philippines became strong, radio stations have also begun to stream their music programs through several streaming sites and even Facebook through Facebook Live. So because of that, they were able to communicate not only their songs, but the cultures that were communicated through those songs that they have aired. So what were the past and current practices, or how did they incorporate those music They incorporated it first as a main content, especially those programs that are purely musical. They used local songs to as a tool for having more audiences and so on. They also used it as background music whenever the DJs or the radio hosts were talking to their audiences. They used it as accompaniments for advertising tools or advertisements, and even they used live performances to incorporate music or the indigenous music in indigenous contemporary music in their programs. What are their motivations and constraints? I found three categories of motivations and constraints that at least influenced or and are influencing this kind of practice in Baguio City. First is economic, second is political, and third is cultural. When we say economic motivations or constraints, the incorporation of indigenous music or indigenous contemporary music in radio stations are based on the profit orientation of their radio stations that are airing them. Um, as we know, commercial stations would like to have the most number of audiences. So one of the methods that they're using to gain more audiences is to incorporate um, popular music. And here in Baguio City and even in Benguet and other provinces in the Cordillera, indigenous contemporary music are actually very popular among the locals here. So they are incorporating these indigenous songs for profit because they are raking in from a lot of money from advertisers who would like to have access to those audiences that they are catering to. There, it's also for cost effectiveness because here in Baguio City, you don't radio stations don't pay royalties to indigenous producers because that's just the practice, and most of the time producers or indigenous producers are the ones giving their music directly to the radio stations to be played for free, so it's cost effective. Political motivations and constraints. Some radio announcers or radio hosts actually have political aspirations. So for them to become more popular, they will incorporate music that are popular also to the locals here. That includes indigenous music. So they are incorporating music in their programs so that they will gain more followers, so that they will gain more votes in the future elections. That is also true when it comes to propaganda, especially in government stations here in Baguio City. And finally, cultural motivations are simply for self-representation and resistance, which I will discuss right now. So how then is broadcasting a tool for cultural mediation and resistance? Let me answer this question by foregrounding the role of music as a tool for the expression and mediation of a producer's culture or cultures. In the case of contemporary indigenous songs in Baguio and Benguet, one of the scholars here in Cordillera, Professor Jimmy Fong, says, although unoriginal in form, contemporary Cordillera songs constitute sign systems for several things. They point to difficult colonial experiences. In other words, the songs constitute an ethnography of the producers and consumers' own cultures. So let me repeat that. The songs constitute an ethnography of the producers and consumers' own cultures. So as a matter of fact, in his extensive analysis or textual analysis of more than dozens of such kinds of songs, he has found that they have consciously and unconsciously communicated their own histories, their own ideas of space, their own identities and worldviews, encounters with modernity, and views in several topics in those songs. So when these songs are disseminated through the airwaves or through radio, those airwaves have become a tool for the extension of the capability of those who produced them in mediating their own cultures, identities, and worldviews. In the case of indigenous peoples in the Cordillera region of the Philippines, radio became a battleground where they fight consciously and unconsciously for not just airtime, but a fight for recognition, a fight for self representation or proper representation and mediation. And it has become a space for resistance and empowerment of those who have been victims of othering, marginalization, and misrepresentation since the country's colonial past. So that's it for my presentation. If you have any questions later, you can actually email me here through this email address. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a beautiful presentation. Uh, in fact, this was a new kind of a presentation for me because I belong from India, and as you rightly said that it for me it was a tour to Philippines sitting online. So thanks for bringing this insight from Philippines to us. Uh, your paper talked in detail about the broadcast media and airways, in particularly having battleground wherein hegemonic and non-hegemonic forces battle for meditation. Sorry,
Okay.
you enlightened on the history of local radio stations of Baguio, which serves as a battlefield where how indigenous people came up with their voices. That is most important. Your paper talked about past and current practices, so it was wonderful. Utilizing historical and ethnographical analysis, your paper explored and explained how the practices were employed by them for self realization. So, thank you so much, sir. It was a wonderful presentation.